She stood on the burning tarmac, her uniform torn, streaked with smoke and dried blood, her breath shallow from the chaos she'd just emerged from. The evacuation rotor blades roared louder than the screams that echoed behind her, but what hit her harder was the cold voice of the officer at the edge of the chopper bay. "You're not on the manifest. Step aside." That should have been the end of her story. Forgotten, rejected, left behind. But when the pilot glanced at the weathered insignia stitched to her shoulder, he froze. And then everything changed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Hours earlier, before the sun pierced through the smoke-choked sky, Rain Herrera had already lived through what most people would call a nightmare. Assigned as a combat medic deep in the Cordellan Mountains, her unit was part of a long-forgotten special detachment, Task Force Sable, built for crisis response in high-risk zones where standard support wouldn't reach in time. There were ghosts in the system, their operations often omitted from official logs for security reasons. Rain had accepted that invisibility as part of the job, because what mattered most wasn't the credit or the recognition. It was saving lives when no one else could. That morning had started with a routine sweep near the cliffs surrounding a refugee settlement. The locals had been caught in a crossfire between two opposing militias, and Rain's team had been dispatched to stabilize the wounded and extract families caught in the middle. But routine collapsed into disaster when an unexpected explosion shook the earth beneath them. A hidden cache of munitions had been triggered remotely, sending plumes of fire into the sky and reducing their forward operating post to rubble within seconds. Rain had been inside the tent, triaging a mother and her 2 children when the blast went off. The shockwave lifted her off her feet, tossing her through the canvas wall and leaving her half buried under sandbags and debris. Her ears rang like sirens. Her body screamed in protest. But when she opened her eyes and saw the child she had just bandaged crying out for help amid the smoke, she pulled herself out and kept moving. By the time Rain had made it back to what remained of the landing zone, the fire had already spread. Several soldiers, those fortunate enough to survive the initial blast, had gathered in a makeshift formation. Evacuation protocols had been initiated, but the extraction chopper was overburdened. Orders were being followed to the letter. Manifested names only. No exceptions. Rain approached, limping, her side bruised from the debris. Her hands were caked with blood. Not hers, but that of Corporal Juno, who she had tried desperately to resuscitate before the convoy was overrun. She had given him every second she could spare. That delay, she now realized, had cost her the window of opportunity to be counted in the evac manifest. The line officer, rigid and expressionless, told her she had no clearance, no listed assignment, no authorization. He didn't even ask for her name. He simply gestured for the next soldier in line. But Rain wasn't just any soldier. Though no one there seemed to recognize her face, her unit's insignia, black eagle over a silver crescent, told a story that few knew and even fewer understood. Task Force Sable had been deployed in the most dangerous rescue ops over the past 5 years, always off record, always under pressure. Their missions weren't broadcast. Their heroes weren't known. And Rain was one of the last original members still active after the unit had been quietly disbanded the year before. She stood still, disoriented but defiant. Her hand hovered over the patch on her sleeve, unsure whether to speak. If the man at the door couldn't recognize the value of what she had done, of what she had given, then maybe her insignia no longer meant anything. Maybe her service had been swallowed whole by a system too slow to care. Around her, engines roared, boots stomped, and the stench of burning oil and panic thickened. She took a step back, feeling the weight of rejection, not just from the chopper crew, but from the very system she had bled for. But just as she turned to walk away, the pilot of the chopper leaned forward from the cockpit, adjusting his helmet. He had only caught a glimpse, But something about that black eagle on her arm snapped him out of the present chaos and into a memory he hadn't visited in years. He called to the officer, asked for Rain's name, and then jumped down from the cockpit stairs before the engine could finish spooling. With urgency in his eyes and disbelief in his voice, he demanded that she be led aboard. The officer hesitated, taken aback by the shift in tone. But the pilot didn't wait for permission. He crossed the bay, pushed past protocol, and pulled back Rain's sleeve to confirm the insignia. His expression changed from doubt to awe. He turned to the crew and barked a single command. "Clear space, now." For the first time that day, Rain saw someone look at her, not as a statistic or a burden, but as someone whose story mattered. And with that unspoken recognition, everything she had endured finally began to mean something again. That was the moment everything changed. But how Rain Herrera came to wear that insignia, why it had nearly disappeared, and what happened after she boarded the helicopter, those answers would come in time. For now, it began with a patch on a uniform, a forgotten name, and a pilot who remembered what others had chosen to ignore. Before the insignia, before the badge that almost got her left behind, Rain Herrera was simply a girl from the outskirts of Elmore Ridge, a forgotten mining town buried deep in the Appalachian Range, where winters came early and dreams were buried even faster than coal. Her mother ran a second-hand bookstore that no one visited anymore, and her father, when he was sober, fixed tractors and power tools for the few families who still hadn't given up on the land. Rain spent most of her childhood in silence, the kind of silence that blankets you when you're raised by disappointment and diesel fumes. The war stories didn't come from comic books or old soldiers at diners. They came from the hollow look in her father's eyes when he talked about the ones who didn't make it back. He had served, too, in a war most people had already stopped talking about by the time she was born. And though he never offered medals or tales of glory, he gave her something more potent. The knowledge that some people serve not for honor, but because they believe no one else will. Rain was never the loudest in school, nor the most gifted. Her grades hovered just above average, and she avoided attention with the skill of a shadow. But even as a teenager, there was a certain precision to her presence, an ability to assess a situation, to observe before acting, to calculate risks in silence, before anyone else even noticed there was a problem. Teachers often overlooked her. Coaches didn't pick her first, but they remembered her when the game got tight. She wasn't trying to be invisible. She just didn't see the point of speaking when no one really listened. It wasn't until her senior year that something shifted. Her mother suffered a mild stroke, nothing catastrophic, but enough to make running the bookstore impossible. Her father, already deep into the cycle of prescription meds and quiet rage, disappeared for 2 weeks with the family truck and returned with a broken windshield and no explanation. Rain, barely 17, took over the household without being asked. She rationed their groceries, picked up hours at the local hardware store, and managed her schoolwork like it was a tactical mission. No complaints. No outbursts. Just quiet, relentless responsibility. That's when she met Sergeant Mallory, a National Guard recruiter who came to speak during a career day that most students used as an excuse to skip class. He noticed Rain not because she asked questions, but because she was the only one who didn't roll her eyes when he spoke about field medicine and frontline logistics. When the session ended, he pulled her aside, not with some grand pitch, but with a simple question. "Have you ever thought about doing more than surviving?" Rain hadn't, not really, but the next day she showed up at the recruiting office, and 2 months later, she was on her way to basic training. There, in the structure of the military, Rain found something she never had at home, a place where her silence wasn't a weakness, where observation was valued, where precision could mean the difference between life and death. She gravitated toward the medical track, not because she had always dreamed of becoming a medic, but because something about bringing order to chaos felt familiar. In trauma scenarios, she thrived. Her instructors noticed it quickly. She wasn't just following instructions, she was reading patterns, staying 2 steps ahead of panic. And when she was offered a chance to join an experimental combat rescue unit in a high-risk program during her 3rd year, she didn't hesitate. Task Force Sable wasn't for show. It wasn't for the headlines or the medals. It was for the soldiers who wouldn't make it without someone like her. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Her deployment history over the next 5 years was buried in classified briefings and redacted reports. Earthquake zones, ambushes gone wrong, biological outbreaks. Any place where time was the enemy and official channels were too slow to respond. Rain operated under pseudonyms, often with just a handful of teammates. She lost friends she wasn't allowed to name. She treated children whose faces still haunted her sleep. And through it all, she kept a single photo tucked inside her field journal. Her mother, standing in front of that forgotten bookstore with a smile as worn as the books behind her. But the military doesn't sustain ghosts forever. When Task Force Sable was disbanded, Rain was reassigned to a transitional field hospital near the Cordellan region, a politically tense zone that few wanted to be stationed in. She didn't complain. She never did. The mission remained the same: stabilize, extract, preserve life, even if no one remembered your name afterward. By the time she found herself on that tarmac, staring down the rejection of an officer who only saw paper and not people, Rain had already carried the weight of hundreds. Her body bore the scars, one across her rib from a sniper's near miss, another on her forearm from dragging a soldier out of a burning convoy. Her mind held even deeper wounds, though she rarely let them surface. To most, she was just another uniform, quiet, forgettable. But those who had been pulled back from the brink by her steady hands knew otherwise. They knew that Reina Herrera had never once asked to be seen, but she had always shown up, again and again, until even the system that failed to remember her was forced to reckon with the truth of who she was. She never sought recognition, but she had earned something greater: the quiet respect of those who had seen her in action, and the kind of legacy that stitched itself not into history books, but into the lives that were still breathing because of her. The Cordellan Ridge was unlike any deployment Reina Herrera had ever experienced. Not because it was the most dangerous, though danger was a constant companion, but because it was the most forgotten. Situated on the jagged border between two provinces in a disputed region that had become a flashpoint for nearly a decade, the terrain was a brutal patchwork of high-altitude forests, broken villages, and skeletal infrastructure long abandoned by the central government. The winters here didn't just sting, they devoured. Storms rolled in with little warning, thick with sleet and wind that bent steel and froze breath mid-sentence. There were no paved roads, no reliable power lines, and the only radio frequencies that worked were the ones you weren't supposed to use. Even when the sky was clear, the air always carried the scent of old ash, scars from past burnouts, and the charred remains of homes that would never be rebuilt. The landing zone, ironically nicknamed Camp Haven by those stationed there, was nothing more than a flattened stretch of hardened dirt surrounded by makeshift barriers of concertina wire and sandbags. Its sole purpose was to serve as a triage point, a temporary post where choppers could land, drop off medics and supplies, and evacuate the wounded before the fighting changed direction again. A thin line of portable field tents hugged the east side of the camp, each one crammed with battered stretchers, supply crates, and medical equipment, held together with duct tape and adrenaline. Rain had slept in one of those tents, usually in between shifts, curled beside crates of gauze and morphine, boots still on, rifle within arm's reach. There were no walls between the wounded and the wilderness, just tarps and the fading promise that backup would come before the night grew too loud. The social dynamics inside Camp Haven were what you'd expect from a place always teetering between emergency and exhaustion. Medics ran on caffeine and guilt, soldiers cycled through shifts of tension and silence, and the command team, limited in both manpower and bandwidth, had to balance between following protocol and improvising survival. Friendships formed quickly, mostly out of shared trauma or necessity, and alliances were rarely built on rank. Respect came from how fast you moved when someone screamed, how steady your hands were in the dark, how much blood you could lose from your own arm while still tending to someone else's gaping wound. There wasn't time for introductions or ego. People learned names after they saw each other in action. And in that world, Rain had quietly become one of the unspoken leaders, not because she asked to be followed, but because when the shooting started or the ground shook, everyone moved when she did. There were no journalists in Cordella, no embedded filmmakers or PR officials documenting heroism. If a soldier died out here, their name would be recorded, eventually, but their story would rarely reach their family in full. The reports were sparse, reduced to technical language: combat fatality, engagement exposure, evac unsuccessful. Rain had memorized that language like scripture. She knew what those codes really meant. She had written more of them than she cared to admit, often by lantern light, while sitting beside the stretcher of someone who didn't make it. She would tuck dog tags into bags, seal them in silence, then return to work before the grief could catch up to her. Yet, amid all the chaos, Cordella had a strange kind of beauty too, one that didn't show itself easily. Just before sunrise, when the mist rolled down the hills and the sky turned a washed-out lavender, the whole valley could look like it was holding its breath. On those mornings, when there were no incoming casualties and the radio was quiet, Rain would stand just outside the perimeter, sip half-warm coffee from a chipped thermos, and feel something close to peace. Birds would return to the shattered trees, goats from nearby villages would bleat from far-off cliffs, and if the wind hit just right, you could almost forget that the ground was laced with landmines and that your name could vanish from the system as easily as smoke in the air. The villagers were both wary and resilient. They had seen too many uniforms to trust anyone easily. But Rain had always had a way with people. She didn't use words to earn their trust. She used presence. She would treat the wounded, even when translators weren't available, use gestures and smiles, clean wounds with the same care she used on her own, and always give a few minutes longer than the schedule allowed. Over time, the children began to run toward her instead of hiding. One old woman gave her a string of handmade beads she said were for protection. Rain tied them around the handle of her trauma shears. They were still there the day she boarded that chopper. The base command center, if it could be called that, was a converted transport container fitted with rusted equipment and patched-up solar batteries. Its walls were cluttered with faded maps, scribbled on whiteboards, and a rotation schedule that changed daily, depending on who had been medevaced, who had snapped, and who simply vanished. There was one satellite terminal that worked only intermittently, through which orders came in bursts, usually unclear and already outdated. Higher command rarely understood the ground truth, and by the time they issued directives, the front line had often shifted miles away. In Cordella, survival meant adaptation. It meant trusting the instincts of those who had bled on that soil, not the bureaucrats who hadn't set foot there in years. This was the world Rain moved through every day, a liminal space where nothing was certain except her mission and the moments she could steal between heartbreaks. It was in this world that her insignia became both a symbol and a relic. Few knew what it stood for anymore. Newer soldiers assumed it was just some outdated division badge. Even the commanding officer hadn't asked about it. But Rain wore it not for recognition. She wore it for the teammates she had lost. For the ones who died in silence, in places just like this, where no cameras captured their courage. That patch was her anchor in a storm of erasure. And it was in this forgotten corner of the world, among the mud and ash and unsung valor, that René Herrera stood at the edge of that helicopter bay, denied access by someone who didn't even know what he was looking at. But the land knew her. The wounded knew her. And soon, someone else would remember too. Lieutenant Darren Coyle was the kind of officer whose authority came not from experience but from protocol. He had a reputation that arrived 5 minutes before he did, meticulous, inflexible, and unsparing. freshly rotated into Cordella from a high-security airbase in the Southern Isles. He wore his uniform like armor and carried his clipboard like a weapon. His boots were always clean, his sleeves always rolled at a regulation angle, and his orders delivered in clipped, bureaucratic language that left no room for interpretation. To Coyle, the war zone wasn't a battleground, it was a spreadsheet waiting to be balanced, and if lives had to be reduced to serial numbers and eligibility codes, then so be it. Efficiency demanded sacrifice. No one could deny he was efficient. Within his first 48 hours at Camp Haven, he had revised the evac protocol, rerouted 2 supply drop schedules, and reorganized the personnel rotation to eliminate what he called redundant placement. He didn't ask for input, and he didn't give explanations. He followed the handbook with a zeal that made older medics uneasy. Those who had lasted in Cordella knew that the handbook often became a liability in places where terrain, time, and terror didn't care about ink on paper. But to Coyle, deviation was weakness. He hadn't yet been in a tent where blood soaked through the cots or watched a soldier die while the radio screamed static. His knowledge came from policy documents, not pain, and that made him dangerous. To most, he wasn't overtly cruel, just cold. He never raised his voice, he never cursed. But he could slice a person in half with a single sentence delivered in front of an audience. He embarrassed Corporal Deeks during a logistics debrief when the young transport officer hesitated on the names of evacuees. He wrote up Sergeant Ling for unauthorized supply deviation after she used 2 extra IV kits on a 6-year-old civilian girl with septic shock. And when rumors surfaced that a few field medics were bypassing formal clearance to smuggle out non-manifested survivors, Coyle responded by ordering double verification guards at the LZ. His words were clear: this isn't a charity, it's a controlled operation. It wasn't long before Rain noticed the shift. The rhythm of Camp Haven changed. Requests for backup began taking longer. Approvals for emergency deployment ran through more hoops. And, most noticeably, the humanity seemed to drain out of the system. Medics whispered about the new rules in the dark. Soldiers grew hesitant to call for early extractions, fearing reprimand. Rain, having operated under every kind of commanding officer, recognized the pattern not from his demeanor, but from the consequences he left behind. Coyle didn't scream, didn't punch walls, didn't order impossible missions. He simply erased flexibility, the one thing that saved lives out here, and in doing so, endangered everyone without lifting a weapon. Rain's first direct clash with Coyle came over a manifest entry. She had just completed a 30-hour cycle after responding to an ambush in the Southern Ridge, when she brought in a wounded local boy who had wandered into a minefield. His legs were torn open, and his blood pressure was dropping fast. Rain stabilized him en route and had every intention of getting him medevaced within the hour. But when she handed in the request, Coyle flagged it. The boy wasn't listed under approved civilian evac parameters. No ID, no paperwork, no prior documentation. Therefore, he didn't qualify. Rain stood in front of him, dirt still clinging to her skin, fatigue hanging from her eyes, and said, plainly, that the boy wouldn't survive another night. Coyle didn't blink. He marked the request with a red slash and moved on to the next line item. That was when Rain began documenting everything, not because she believed the reports would ever reach someone who cared, but because she needed a record. Not just of the decisions Coyle made, but of the people affected by them. In the margins of her field notebook, alongside medication schedules and supply shortages, she began writing down names, ages, and final heart rates. Not for retaliation, for remembrance. When the explosion at the southern outpost occurred, an incident that would later be blamed on improper ordnance disposal by locals, it was Coyle who delayed the dispatch order by 19 minutes, citing lack of confirmation from Central Command. Those 19 minutes meant the difference between a full evacuation and a desperate triage scramble. By the time the first chopper arrived, fire had consumed 3 medical tents, and half a squad was missing. Rain, already in the zone and buried in ash and blood, pulled out who she could. She carried bodies while Coyle was still verifying clearance codes. And so, when she staggered back to the landing zone hours later, battered and smeared with the blood of the fallen, she wasn't surprised to see him standing at the edge of the helicopter bay, clipboard in hand, expression blank as stone. He didn't recognize her immediately. In that moment, she was just another casualty limping toward him, seeking refuge. He didn't look at her eyes. He didn't see the cuts on her knuckles or the ripped insignia dangling from her sleeve. He just said the words like they were etched into his bones. "You're not on the manifest. Step aside." That sentence, delivered without malice or hesitation, crystallized everything Rain feared about people like him. It wasn't hate that destroyed. It was indifference. It was the belief that lives only mattered when they were documented, approved, and delivered in triplicate. That was the real antagonist here. Not just Coyle, but everything he represented. A system where paperwork held more weight than proof. Where heroism was discarded because it didn't fit neatly in a column. Coyle didn't remember the insignia, but he didn't need to. He had already decided who she was. And in doing so, he had revealed who he was, an enforcer of rules without understanding their purpose, a gatekeeper of rescue who had never bled in the mud he was trying to control. But the world didn't always follow his rules, and Rain was about to remind him of that in a way he wouldn't soon forget. There was a rhythm to Cordella, as cruel and predictable as the tremor of incoming mortar fire or the dead calm that preceded an ambush. For those stationed long enough in the region, the rhythm became second nature, like a heartbeat you didn't think about until it stopped. And for Reina Herrera, that rhythm was steeped in repetition. Wake before dawn, often to the sound of distant artillery or the coughing of a child with untreated pneumonia. Report to the triage tent, where half the wounded wouldn't have names, and the other half would whisper them only once. Pack gear, load IVs, recalibrate field monitors that had survived more crashes than they should have. Step into the chaos. Repeat. What had once been flexible and intuitive had, under Lieutenant Coyle's regime, become rigid and methodical. Every day now began with a compliance briefing, where Coyle reviewed metrics on supply usage, evacuation totals, and protocol adherence. He would address the assembled personnel in clipped tones, eyes scanning the group for any signs of dissent, while behind him a dry erase board listed codes and clearance procedures. This was not a war to him. It was an equation. One Rain was forced to solve every single day without all the variables. What this meant, in practice, was that lives were slowly slipping through the cracks. The new pattern unfolded with a disturbing precision. Someone would call in for early medevac due to internal bleeding or deteriorating vitals, only to be met with a request for additional proof. A chopper would be prepped, then held for review because a name on the manifest was misspelled. Civilians who had traveled miles on foot with broken limbs would be told to wait until their village liaison submitted proper identification. It wasn't overt cruelty. It was bureaucracy deployed like a weapon, disguised as order. Rain began to track the pattern with growing dread. She would witness the same dance every shift, the cry over the comms. Urgent evac needed. Chest trauma, non-responsive. Then the delay. Then the call from logistics, usually asking for an authorization string or an updated report. Then the medic's voice lowering, slower now, as they responded. Vitals fading. ETA, too long. Then silence, and then the file would close before the name could be memorized. It wasn't that the people stopped trying. It was that they began to hesitate. That hesitation, born from knowing their requests might be denied or delayed, changed everything. Even Rainey, who had once moved without question, began to pause before calling for assistance. Not because she feared punishment. She had long ceased caring about reprimands, but because she knew that every request carried weight, and every request was now being scrutinized by someone who didn't understand what it meant to hold a person's life in your hands, while the air thickened with smoke and time slipped like water through fingers. And yet, she kept going, That was the cruelest part of the pattern. No matter how much red tape wrapped around her wrists, she never stopped working. Each day, she would pull someone out of a collapsed shack or piece together a shattered limb. She learned to patch without permission, to stabilize without support. There was no glory in it, no recognition, just quiet defiance, wrapped in gauze and grit. There was one boy, Neelan, from a hillside hamlet northwest of the main ridge. He had been caught in a flare trap meant for scouting patrols. Rain had worked on him for 2 hours, cauterizing tissue and replacing fluid faster than her assistant could load new syringes. She knew, by every metric, that he wouldn't make it without airlift. She submitted the evac request anyway, attaching photos, vitals, and 3 separate medical justifications. It was denied. No prior record, no regional contact, no approval. She watched him die that night, his small hand gripping her sleeve, her teeth clenched so tight she didn't notice she was bleeding from the gums. After that, the ritual began to feel like a cage. Rain stopped going to the morning briefings. She started carrying 2 notebooks, one for official records, one for the truth. She wrote Neelan's name in the second one. Alongside his, Miriam, age 10, shrapnel wound to the abdomen, died waiting for surgical approval. Amir, 37, lung puncture, expired during airlift debate. Zara, 58, cardiac failure, never made it onto the transport list. They weren't statistics to her. They were stories that would never be told unless she told them. Even among the other medics, the shift in morale was palpable. Laughter, once used to cope, grew rarer. Conversations became terse. Sleep grew lighter. No one said it outright. But everyone knew they were working under a weight that didn't need to be there. And at the center of that pressure was a man with a clipboard who believed in process over people. The only consistency in Rain's life now was resistance. She didn't rebel loudly. That wasn't her way. She simply refused to be reshaped by the coldness around her. Every time she was told no, she found another path. If an evac was denied, she would stabilize the patient for longer. If a supply request was delayed, she would barter, swap, or scavenge. She taught younger medics how to work around the system without being caught. She kept Task Force Sable alive, not as a unit, but as a mindset. Do what's necessary, not what's approved. There was, however, a danger to repetition. It made people predictable, and predictability, in a place as volatile as Cordella, could get you killed. Rain knew this, but the alternative, compliance, apathy, surrender, wasn't in her blood. She had survived long enough by adapting, but now she was fighting just to maintain the freedom to do what was right. The rhythm she had once trusted had been replaced by a slow suffocation of autonomy, one checkbox at a time. The pattern was clear now. The system no longer served the people, it served itself, and as long as people like Coyle sat at the helm, lives like Neelan's would keep disappearing into paperwork. But patterns, like pressure, have limits. Sooner or later, something would snap. Jessa could hardly feel her legs beneath her as she trudged down the battered path toward the village's northern ridge. The rain had finally stopped, but the air remained thick with smoke, the pungent stench of charred wood and metal clinging to every breath she took. Her ears still rang from the explosion that had nearly knocked her unconscious back at the supply route, and her uniform was stiff with mud and dried blood, some of it hers, most of it not. She kept her hand tightly pressed to the satchel tucked under her arm, its soaked leather protecting the bundle of field notes, radio logs, and hand-drawn maps she had collected during the past 72 hours. All of it was evidence, proof that what had happened to her unit wasn't a freak ambush or miscommunication. It was a betrayal. One that had started long before the firefight, the rerouted convoy, and the unmarked mines. She couldn't stop thinking about Ren. About the exact way she had slumped forward after being hit, still gripping the old medkit they used to joke about, still trying to reach her patient, even as the bullets kept flying. Jessa hadn't had time to bury her. None of them did. The only thing she'd been able to do was remove Ren's insignia and slip it into her vest pocket, the one next to her heart. She had made a quiet promise then. Under the howl of gunfire and the drone of distant drones, she would not let their names disappear into the silence. She would make someone see them. And that meant surviving long enough to tell the story. The only direction left to go was north, where an old relief post had once stood near the ridge, now supposedly repurposed into a forward outpost with airlift capability. She hadn't received confirmation. Comms were still spotty, but the glint of distant antennas suggested she might be right. She clung to that hope like a lifeline. The climb was grueling. Jagged rock outcroppings and washed-out trails slowed her progress to a crawl. Twice she slipped, and once she almost didn't get up. But each time, the weight of the satchel reminded her she had no choice. Her knuckles were raw, her breath shallow, and her vision clouded by a film of smoke and exhaustion when she finally reached the ridge's crest. She almost didn't register the rows of camouflage tents until a low hum, one that cut through the usual forest drone, reached her ears. A helicopter. It sounded like it was prepping for takeoff. Adrenaline surged through her battered body. She broke into a run, every muscle screaming, every breath a fiery gasp. The clearing came into view like a scene from a dream. Olive-drab canvas shelters, satellite dishes, comm towers blinking faint red against the gray sky, and, most importantly, a black and silver helicopter perched on a makeshift landing pad, its rotors slowly gaining speed. She stumbled toward it, waving one arm, shouting, though her voice cracked, and failed after the first call. A pair of guards at the pad entrance stepped into her path, weapons raised but not aimed. She skidded to a stop, chest heaving, mud flying from her boots. One of them narrowed his eyes and demanded to know her name and clearance. She gave it. The other guard, a younger man with a nervous twitch in his jaw, tapped at his comm unit and waited for a response. Jessa swayed on her feet. She was so close now. So close. Then came the words that felt like a second ambush. "You're not on the manifest. Orders are to restrict boarding to approved personnel only." Jessa tried to explain. That her unit had been wiped out. That she had information. That lives would be at risk if this wasn't passed along. The guards exchanged a look. The younger one looked uneasy, but the older one's jaw was firm. "We're under strict protocol. No badge, no board." Jessa almost collapsed. She couldn't go back. Not through that jungle, not past the remnants of her fallen unit. Not again. She pleaded. She didn't even know what words came out of her mouth, only that she said them through cracked lips and a hoarse voice that barely carried over the roar of the chopper. The crew was loading supply crates now. The pilot was climbing into the cockpit. She was losing time. She fell to her knees in front of the guards, digging desperately into her vest until she pulled out Ren's insignia, her fingers trembling as she held it out like a lifeline. It was stained, scorched at the edges but still recognizable. The younger guard flinched, eyes widening slightly. "What unit is that?" Jessa whispered the numbers and the old call sign. The older guard frowned. "That can't be right. That unit was disbanded 5 months ago. They're not in rotation anymore." Jessa shook her head violently. "No," she rasped. "We were rerouted. Northern Corridor. Recon and aid. We never made it back." Her voice broke then, not from weakness, but from the sheer weight of having to say it aloud. The young guard turned away and spoke into his comm again, fast and urgent this time. Jessa didn't hear the response. Her body had given out, and she was sitting now, barely conscious, blood pooling in her boot from a wound she hadn't even registered. Just as her vision began to blur completely, a tall figure in a flight suit strode up behind the guards, barking an order. The guards parted. The pilot, a woman with a weathered face and sharp eyes, looked down at Jessa, then at the insignia in her hand. Her face paled. Jessa's last memory before blacking out was of the pilot lowering herself beside her and whispering, "I flew with these people once. You're getting on that bird." The desert wind howled through the twisted remnants of a supply convoy that hadn't stood a chance. Flames licked the underside of a scorched vehicle frame, the air thick with acrid smoke and the cloying scent of burned rubber and blood. Imelda crouched low, one hand gripping her side, where a gash from shrapnel pulsed in sync with her heartbeat. The other hand steadied her rifle, its barrel shaking only slightly now that the adrenaline had started to override her pain. She wasn't alone. Behind her, 2 surviving medics from Echo 3 unit huddled beside a downed civilian contractor whose leg had been partially severed by an explosion. There was no time to process the horror, no space to retreat into grief. They were being hunted. The radio on her vest crackled to life. A burst of static followed by a sharp voice calling her name. It was Lucas, his tone clipped and urgent, telling her the evacuation point had moved again, and they had barely 20 minutes to make it there. She didn't hesitate. Gritting her teeth against the pain, Imelda rose to her feet, her boots crunching over broken glass and charred sand, and barked a sharp command to move. The others followed her lead without question. Even now, limping, bloodied, and navigating a hellscape, her authority was instinctively obeyed. That was what it meant to be part of Vanguard. Leaders weren't made in classrooms. They were born in chaos, forged in fire. They moved in short bursts, zigzagging across the ruined terrain, every step a gamble. The smoke offered some cover, but the enemy patrols weren't far behind. At one point, they had to hide under the hull of a flipped water truck, while a drone buzzed overhead, its camera lens sweeping like an unblinking eye. Imelda's breath was shallow, controlled. She pressed a trembling hand over the contractor's mouth to keep him from crying out in panic. Her wound throbbed, sticky blood soaking through her flak vest, but she didn't dare stop. When the drone passed, they emerged and ran. 10 more minutes to the new evac site, maybe less if they cut through the abandoned refinery. It was a risk. They didn't know who or what was left inside, but they had no choice. As they approached the compound, the air grew hotter, thicker, choked with industrial residue that hadn't faded even after years of neglect. Inside, metal groaned under the weight of time, and every shadow looked like it could house death. Imelda took point, rifle raised, eyes scanning every corridor, her instincts sharpened by too many missions gone sideways. She moved like someone who had already died once and refused to do it again. In the center of the refinery, they encountered resistance, 2 enemy scouts who'd had the same idea, using the place as a shortcut. There was no time for hesitation. Imelda acted before they even raised their weapons, her shots precise and controlled. The echoes of the gunfire seemed to ripple through the walls, and suddenly the silence was replaced by shouting. More enemy troops were coming. They had minutes, maybe seconds. She turned to the others, helped one medic sling the contractor over his shoulder, and barked the route to follow. The exit would be on the south side, a broken loading dock that fed into a narrow gorge leading to the evac point. She stayed behind to cover them, crouched behind rusted piping, firing in short, vicious bursts. The pain in her side threatened to unmake her. Blood dripped from her fingers now. She was losing too much, too fast. But she stayed until she heard the others clear the far corridor. Then she ran, stumbled, ran again. Outside, the sun was setting, casting an amber glow over the jagged cliffs and wrecked machinery. The dust shimmered like embers in the air. She rounded the bend and saw the gorge, and beyond it, the helicopter. Its blades were already spinning, kicking up a cyclone of grit and heat. Relief surged through her, but it was short-lived. At the base of the ramp, 2 armed guards raised their rifles, signaling her to stop. She slowed, confused, her hand going to her badge, her name tag, anything that might identify her. One of them stepped forward, helmet obscuring his face, and barked that she wasn't on the manifest. Evac was full. No exceptions. Imelda blinked, unsure if she had heard him right. She pointed behind her. Her unit was already aboard, bleeding, alive because of her. But the guard didn't budge. "Protocol," he said. They didn't take unknowns. The roar of the rotors drowned out the rest. For a moment she stood frozen. Her legs ached, her lungs burned, and behind her the enemy might already be closing in. She had dragged them all through hell to get here, and now, at the very last moment, she was being erased. Her heart thudded in her ears. The second guard turned away, lifting the ramp lever. The helicopter was about to lift off, and then, through the noise, a figure appeared at the door of the chopper. A man in pilot gear leaned out, his gaze locking onto her, as if struck by something familiar. His eyes dropped to her arm, torn sleeve exposing a patch barely clinging to her skin, the insignia of Vanguard, singed but unmistakable. His mouth moved, a shout, a command. The guard stepped back, confusion written across his face. And suddenly, the ramp was lowering again. Imelda staggered forward, unsure if this was real or the final hallucination of a dying mind. But it wasn't. The pilot was coming down the ramp, his hand outstretched, recognition and disbelief etched in every line of his face. The storm moved in with the kind of fury that seemed almost sentient, as if the heavens themselves were trying to prevent Casey from reaching her destination. Rain fell in sharp needles, cutting visibility to mere feet, and thunder rolled so low and constant it seemed to vibrate the bones. Yet even nature's wrath couldn't rival the chaos unfolding below in the scorched valleys of El Rehab. Casey's team, scattered and wounded, had managed to regroup at a temporary shelter near a collapsed communications outpost. What remained of their supplies had been pulled from wreckage, and the wounded lay on stretchers improvised from broken fencing and parachute canvas. It was in that moment, under siege from both the sky and the silence of being forgotten, that the reality settled in. They weren't just cut off, they were written off. Casey hadn't slept in over 36 hours. Her clothes were soaked through with sweat, mud, and dried blood, not all of it hers, and her right hand still bore the scar from a recent explosion that had singed her gloves clean off. But her mind remained sharp. She moved from patient to patient, checking pulses, applying pressure, rationing water in tiny spoonfuls, like liquid gold. Every few minutes, she would glance at the broken satellite radio, as if sheer willpower might bring it back to life. It didn't. The waiting clawed at her nerves. Her lieutenant, Anna Deshmukh, who had regained enough consciousness to sit up, gave her a weary nod of respect as she noticed Casey still moving, still leading. The unspoken weight between them was clear. This rescue wasn't coming. If Casey didn't act soon, they were going to lose people not to combat, but to neglect. Then, like a small miracle, the thump of rotors began echoing through the storm, faint at first, nearly drowned by the rain, but unmistakable. Casey stumbled outside, boots sinking into the thick, red mud. Her heart thudded harder than the rain around her as she spotted the Black Hawk breaking through the low clouds, wobbling slightly against the violent wind shear. She sprinted toward the makeshift landing zone, a clearing of scorched earth marked with a torn combat jacket waving from a rusted pole. As the helicopter touched down with a violent gust that blew debris and water in every direction, a figure emerged from the side cabin and motioned frantically. But, as Casey approached, her relief was instantly ripped away. The crew chief, wearing dark glasses and a rigid expression, stepped forward, blocking her. She could barely hear him over the blades, but the words were clear. She wasn't authorized. They had no record of her unit. She didn't exist on their evac list. Her badge was outdated, and the insignia on her shoulder was no longer recognized. Confusion collided with disbelief, then rapidly morphed into rage. She tried to explain, to plead, to show them Anna's tags, the wounded, just meters away. She pointed to the unit insignia on her shoulder, the curved wings with the inverted dagger, an emblem of a classified recon unit long since disbanded on paper, but still very real in blood. The crew chief shook his head. His orders were precise. Verify only listed personnel. No exceptions. No deviations. Time was short. Fuel was low. As they turned to reboard, something inside Casey cracked, not with desperation, but with resolve. She took 3 strides forward and unstrapped her field journal from her belt, flipping it open to a laminated photo of her original squad taken during training in Fort Ashfield 5 years earlier. Her face was younger, her smile wider, and on her arm, the same insignia now smeared with grime, stood out clearly. A flicker of recognition danced in the co-pilot's eyes as he leaned over the chief's shoulder. There was hesitation now. The pilot, still seated in the cockpit, turned slightly as if he'd caught a word or signal that didn't match protocol. Casey stood there, unmoving, rain pouring down her cheeks like tears, holding that photo high like a torch in the darkness. Then the pilot's door opened. Slowly, methodically, he stepped down into the mud, his boots splashing beside hers. He was older than most, with gray streaks across his temples and a deeply lined face. But the moment his eyes landed on the insignia, his expression shifted from professional neutrality to solemn recognition. He stepped closer, reached out, and brushed a finger across the patch. His voice, low and cracked with memory, said just 2 words: "Bravo Crescent." That was it. No more questions. No more orders. He waved his hand to the crew chief and barked something Casey couldn't hear, but it worked. The gates opened. Suddenly, hands were helping the wounded onto stretchers. A medic rushed past her toward Anna. Another crewman rolled out emergency supplies. Casey stood frozen for a beat, her heart still catching up to what had just happened. The pilot looked back at her once more and nodded. He didn't need her explanation. He didn't need proof. He remembered, and in that shared memory, buried beneath redacted files and discarded glory, her unit lived again, if only for a few minutes longer. As the crew loaded the last of the injured, Casey climbed in last, her boots slipping in the mud, her body shaking not from cold, but from the release of holding it together for far too long. The bird lifted off just as the rain began to ease, revealing the scarred valley below like a battlefield exhaling one final time. And through it all, Casey held on to that moment, not of recognition, but of resurrection. Her unit's name had been buried, but its legacy had just pierced the clouds. The sun hung lower in the sky as Cora sat in the shade of a makeshift tarp, hands trembling from the weight of everything she'd seen that day. The air smelled like diesel, sweat, and scorched earth. Around her, the camp buzzed with motion, new supplies arriving, wounded being triaged, and small children clutching emergency rations while looking up at her with wide, unblinking eyes. She'd worked straight through the past 36 hours with barely more than a 10-minute break, administering aid, rationing medicine, and comforting shell-shocked survivors who hadn't even processed their losses yet. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a frayed wire, one breath away from snapping. Yet, despite the weight pressing on her chest, she refused to slow down. Not now. Not when she knew that every hour mattered in this place. Beside her, Dr. Tolman scribbled notes onto a pad, his hands stained with iodine and dried blood. Cora noticed the way his jaw clenched whenever he looked up. He'd been quiet since the morning, since that call had come through from the capital, that the air corridor had reopened. Relief flights would be inbound within the next 24 hours, yet there was no guarantee that any of the rescue personnel already on the ground would be given seats to return. For some, that was fine, but for Cora, it meant something else entirely. She wasn't just here to heal, she was here to report, to testify, and her silence would be as good as betrayal. She looked across the clearing where Lolly, a 12-year-old girl she had treated for severe burns, now helped pass out canisters of clean water. Despite the bandages across her arms, the girl wore a look of quiet purpose, of determination far beyond her years. Cora had seen that same expression before, in mirrors, back when she was younger, still searching for meaning in the rubble of her own life. There was something in Lolly's eyes that steadied her now, something that made her stand up and push through her fatigue. She'd told herself years ago that she didn't believe in fate or destiny, but moments like these challenged her skepticism. She was meant to be here. That much she felt down to her bones, and yet, the gnawing concern remained: how much longer would she be allowed to stay? Or worse, would they pull her out too soon? She had only begun to uncover what was really happening in the Northeastern District, where rumors of systemic neglect, government interference, and black market diversions of aid supplies kept surfacing among the villagers. Her instincts screamed that it went deeper than what anyone wanted to admit, and if she left now, it might all be buried. That evening, during a briefing by satellite phone, Commander Lee informed her that the last supply chopper would be returning with personnel in 2 days. Official word was that civilian units like hers were no longer required in the field, especially since international teams would be arriving to replace them. But Cora knew that was code. The kinds of teams being sent weren't neutral. They were being flown in by those with something to hide. She paced outside the clinic tent long after the call ended, barely aware of the sun slipping below the horizon. Each crunch of gravel beneath her boots reminded her of the limited time she had left. She needed to finish gathering testimony, compiling photos, backing up documents on encrypted drives. She had to keep her evidence from falling into the wrong hands, and somehow get it into the right ones. There was only one person she could think of who might help: Faris. Captain Faris Najem was a pilot she'd worked with on her previous deployment in the mountains of Karsa. He wasn't just a skilled flyer, he was one of the few people in the chain of command she genuinely trusted, loyal to the mission, not the bureaucracy. Last she'd heard, he was stationed 3 zones west, running supply drops between Iskra and the coastal airbase. If she could get a message through to him, maybe, just maybe, he'd understand the stakes. She tapped into her SatLink and began typing a direct line message through encrypted relay. It was risky. If anyone intercepted it, it could expose everything. But she kept it vague enough to fly under the radar. A simple phrase at the end, "Still wearing the insignia you gave me," was the only clue he'd need to know it was her and that it mattered. She hit send and shut the screen, her heart racing. All she could do now was wait. The next day came with both dread and hope. She spent the morning documenting final case files, distributing the last of their antibiotics, and helping relocate the most critical patients to higher ground as another storm system approached from the west. Between tasks, she kept glancing skyward, listening for the low, rhythmic thunder of rotor blades. Just after 3 p.m. she heard it. A dull hum turned into a roar, and the camp erupted into a flurry of motion as people gathered near the landing zone. The helicopter touched down amid a swirl of dust, its side emblazoned with the same emblem she remembered from her last deployment, the Firebird of Squadron 9, the same unit Faris had once been part of. Her pulse spiked. But when she approached the helicopter, rucksack strapped to her shoulders, an unfamiliar officer stepped in her path. His nameplate read Lieutenant Commander Rusk. Without even letting her speak, he raised a hand. Orders are to prioritize Category Red evacuees and pre-listed personnel. You're not on the manifest. Cora stood frozen, the words sinking in slowly. She had documents, she had clearance, she had a mission, but none of it mattered if her name had been removed from the official channels. "Please," she said, voice tight with urgency. "I need to get to the capital. There's something happening out here you don't know about." The man didn't flinch. "Not my problem." She opened her pack, pulled out a folded cloth patch, the insignia of her former unit, a faded phoenix rising from ashes, the one Faris had given her 3 years ago. She held it up silently. Across the clearing, one of the co-pilots turned, eyes catching the insignia. He nudged the pilot. The man paused, leaned out of the cockpit window. His eyes locked onto the patch in her hand. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, and then he stood. That's when she saw it. the unmistakable silhouette of Captain Ferris Najam stepping out into the sun. His eyes met hers, and everything changed. The heat pressed against her back as Clara pushed herself forward through the fractured terrain, sweat soaking her undershirt beneath the loose tactical gear, the rhythmic pounding of her boots on scorched soil echoing like a drumbeat of survival. Smoke coiled through the valley, casting a gray veil over what remained of Sector Echo, once a temporary hub for displaced civilians, now reduced to rubble. Her medic satchel bounced lightly against her side, lighter than usual, its contents depleted in the hours since the last airdrop failed to arrive. Around her, the remnants of Alpha Unit were a scattered thread of exhausted bodies and frayed morale, eyes vacant from the horror they had witnessed. Yet it was Clara, not the highest-ranking officer, who walked ahead with purpose, one hand steadying the young corporal they had rescued hours ago from a collapsed outpost, the other gripping her battered radio, static hissing like a low warning behind every call. She hadn't slept since before dawn, and her body threatened to betray her at every step, but she knew better than to stop. There was still a chance. Back at the forward field base, the response team had misclassified their situation as stabilized, relying on outdated surveillance from satellites that hadn't updated in over 18 hours. According to command, no emergency exfiltration was necessary. But the truth was far more urgent. Fires continued to flare in the west, due to enemy munitions detonating near fuel stores, and one of the surviving snipers had reported seeing movement across the ridge, shadows that didn't match the chaos of retreating civilians or scavengers. Whatever was left of the enemy was still there, waiting. And Alpha Unit, down to a skeleton crew of medics, signalers, and wounded, had less than a day's worth of supplies and no functioning heavy weaponry. Clara had submitted the emergency evac code hours ago. No reply. She tried the backup channel. Silence. It was only when she switched to the rarely used EchoTac frequency that a reply finally crackled through, barely audible. A chopper would be dispatched at 0600 hours. But command hadn't confirmed whether it was a single scout vehicle or a full medical evac. Time was not on their side, and trust in distant brass was thinner than the smoke in their lungs. As she reached the perimeter of the old makeshift helipad, cleared months ago by another unit, but recently overrun by vines and debris, Clara dropped her gear and got to work with the rest of the survivors. Word had spread that a pilot named Arlen was inbound. No one knew him personally, but rumor held that he'd flown for Blackbird Recon before transferring to tactical evac after refusing to transport what he called ghost cargo, bodies of soldiers marked MIA but never accounted for. He was said to have principles, a memory for details, and a deep disdain for top-down decisions that endangered boots on the ground. If anyone might overlook command's dismissive tone, it would be him. That hope was all they had. By mid-afternoon, the group had managed to clear enough space for the helicopter's landing, using salvaged signal mirrors to mark a crude circle around the clearing. Clara coordinated triage zones, repurposed an old water drum as a medical station, and assigned 2 of the less injured techs to monitor the ridgeline for any movement. Her voice was rasping from yelling over the noise, her skin scratched and dirty, but her presence was grounding. She was a medic, but today she was command. They all looked to her not for orders, but for certainty. And she gave it to them, not because she felt brave, but because she knew the moment they saw fear on her face, they would crumble. The sun began its descent as a distant thump, thump, thump began to vibrate through the air. Heads turned upward as the distinctive form of the twin-rotor Blackhawk pierced through the haze, its sleek body dancing above the smoldering valley like a bird gliding through smoke trails. The soldiers waved flares and panels. The chopper dipped low, circling once, then hovered for a moment over the clearing. Then, to Cala's horror, it began to ascend again. Voices rose in panic. Was it leaving? Was it turning back? The radio crackled again. Unauthorized zone. No medical clearance on file for pickup. Standing by for updated directive. The message wasn't angry. It was cold, distant, protocol overriding humanity once again. Clara didn't hesitate. She sprinted across the clearing, arms waving, then yanked the satchel from her side and tore open the outer flap. From it, she pulled a crimson-marked map and a sealed signal card, then held up her arm. On it, burned into the fabric of her uniform, was a small hand-stitched insignia, one the pilot would recognize. It was the Phoenix patch, issued only to medics trained under the old Joint Recovery Program, a unit long since dissolved after the command deemed them too sympathetic. Arlen had flown with the Phoenix team once, years ago. She prayed he remembered. The chopper wavered, stilled in mid-air. Then the voice on the radio came again, this time different. Lower, more personal. "Phoenix Team 7. That you down there?" Clara lifted the patch higher, lips chapped and cracked from the wind, and shouted into the wind. "Still burning, sir." There was a pause. Then the chopper tilted, angled lower, and began its descent. They were coming in. The sun dipped low over the ridge as Lena and the two children emerged from the underbrush, dust and sweat streaking their faces, their steps uncertain yet determined. The jungle had thinned into scattered trees, and then sparse brush, giving way to a clearing where the air hung heavier, filled with distant hums and smells of fuel and smoke. In the valley below, like a scene pulled from a fever dream, lay the temporary forward operating base she had not seen in weeks. A dozen tents formed a makeshift camp around a central clearing where a single helicopter stood, with its rotors still, blades stretched like a giant's idle hands. There were soldiers everywhere, their uniforms a blur of different ranks and units, moving with urgency and exhaustion, unaware that a woman was about to arrive with the last surviving members of a lost village. Lena tightened the sling that held her injured shoulder, motioned for the kids to stay behind a small boulder at the edge of the hill, and slowly descended. She had no idea what kind of welcome she would receive, whether they'd mistake her for a deserter, a stranger, or worse, a threat. But she had no choice. They had made it this far, and now the real test would begin. She stepped into the open with her hands slightly raised, not as a surrender, but as a signal. No threat, only urgency. The first soldier who noticed her shouted something over his shoulder, and two others raised their rifles. She didn't flinch. One glance at her torn and bloodied uniform, the dirt-caked insignia barely clinging to her sleeve, and the unmistakable air of command that clung to her posture even now, was enough to give them pause. A sergeant approached, suspicious eyes darting between her and the tree line. She identified herself, rank, unit, and mission. He radioed it in, confusion written across his face, as the radio crackled back in a tone somewhere between disbelief and protocol. Within minutes, an officer approached with more authority in his gait, his expression shifting rapidly from annoyance to recognition to something bordering on guilt. He had seen her name before, on a list, she guessed, or maybe in a report stamped with "Missing Presumed Dead." But there she was, very much alive, and carrying something far more valuable than intelligence. Two children who should not have survived the ambush weeks ago. She led the officer to the edge of the rocks where the kids had hidden, coaxing them out gently. When the medics saw the state they were in, everything accelerated. Blankets, water, stretchers, all rushed in as if the camp had suddenly remembered its humanity. She sat on the ground beside them as they were examined, the medics quietly amazed at how little trauma the children displayed, despite the conditions. Lena's heart felt heavy with fatigue, but her spine remained straight. She had kept a promise, not just to herself or to the mission, but to the ghosts of the villagers who never made it. The officer returned, now accompanied by a man in pilot's gear with streaks of gray in his hair, and an expression that changed the moment his eyes fell on Lena's right arm. The insignia, barely visible beneath layers of grime and blood, caught the sunlight just enough for him to see. Something in him stilled. He stepped forward slowly, asked to see her patch. She didn't resist, though her arm ached as she raised it. He reached out and gently brushed away the dirt. His eyes welled up, not from pity, but from memory. He told the others to stand down. He had flown with her unit before. He knew what they had done, who they were. He remembered her name now. He didn't just allow her near the chopper. He insisted. The kids would be taken first, along with a medic. Lena would follow. As they waited for the bird to be prepped, the officer explained that communication had broken down during the ambush. Their last satellite ping had placed her unit too far north. No one had thought to look in the southern pass. They had been written off. Lena said nothing. What could she say? That she had survived because of sheer spite? Because she refused to let the screams of a burning village be the last thing she remembered? That the faces of those two children had pulled her from the edge of hopelessness? She simply nodded and stood when the helicopter blades began to spin. She helped the medic lift the girl first, then the boy. Both had drifted into a light sleep. As she climbed aboard, the pilot turned to her again and said he would make sure command heard everything about what she had done, about her unit's sacrifice, about what still lived on because of her refusal to quit. Lena settled into her seat, the roar of the engine overtaking the valley below. The base shrank as they lifted into the sky, and she allowed herself one long breath, not of relief, but of transition. The journey was not over. There would be questions, reports, maybe medals, maybe silence. But she had made it out. The children were safe. The insignia on her arm meant something again. And soon, the world would remember what it had almost forgotten. The radio buzzed softly, its static murmuring as dusk crept over the ruined village. Above, the sky hung heavy with clouds, the color of old bruises. Annika crouched low behind the broken archway of a collapsed school, her side pressed into crumbling stone, the scent of scorched earth and diesel thick in the air. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from fatigue. She had been running on instinct and adrenaline for hours now, long past the point of pain or rational calculation. The two children beside her, May and Jaro, huddled close. Their clothes were singed and torn, their eyes wide with that hollow kind of shock that Annika had seen in far too many civilians. She gently placed a hand on Jaro's shoulder, grounding him with a faint squeeze, and whispered reassurance without words. In the far distance, over the scorched ridge, the low chug of a helicopter echoed once more, still out of sight, but slowly drawing closer. It wasn't the sound of a rescue bird, not yet. It was a question, a risk, a test of what they had left. Earlier that day, the brief skirmish had turned into a siege. The enemy had pushed deeper than anyone expected. The communications hub was jammed, air support was delayed, and ground troops were thinning. The last squad Annika had coordinated with, the 17th Recon, had been scattered across 3 zones, most of them unreachable. She had pulled the children from the rubble of an exploded food distribution center. Their parents had been among the dead. No one else had seen them survive. It had been instinct again, not protocol, that led Annika to carry them on her back, half dragged and half shielded, across sniper territory and falling debris to this barely usable cover. In doing so, she had given up her rendezvous point and her chance to exfil with the rest of her mobile unit, but she didn't regret it, not for one moment. Every hour since had been a quiet war against despair and delay. She had scouted potential extraction sites, jury-rigged a signal flare from a cracked med pack and a flashlight bulb, and hoped someone, anyone, was still watching the skies. When the first helicopter passed overhead without even slowing, she knew the official routes were abandoned. The pilot had probably seen the flare, but in a conflict zone where ambushes and false signals were common, they had to be cautious. The battlefield had changed. She didn't blame them. She just hated the gnawing sense that these children would pay the price of caution. But then, just as night threatened to seal the region in total blackout, another chopper emerged. Lower, Slower, not searching in the general direction, but tracking. Deliberate. Controlled. Annika rose slowly from cover, one hand raised, the other gripping the folded field journal she'd used as makeshift ID. She stepped out from the shadows, eyes fixed on the aircraft's undercarriage. The bird circled once, close enough now to see the side doors marked with faded blue and white stripes, the insignia of a medivac unit once disbanded, her old unit's colors. She had helped repaint those stripes 2 years ago before reassignment. She stepped further into the open. For a brief moment, the chopper seemed to hesitate mid-air. The side door remained shut, but then a flash of movement inside, the pilot leaning to get a clearer look through the open side window. Annika didn't know who it was yet, but something in the way the rotor slowed told her they saw her, not as a civilian, not as a question mark, but as a soldier, a sister in arms, someone remembered. The door opened. The winch dropped. She didn't waste a second. She secured the harness around May first, then Jaro, signaling for them to hold tight. One by one, the children rose into the sky. Annika waited at the base of the landing zone until both were inside. Only then did she give the all-clear. Her boots left the ground last. The dust whipped into her face as the bird rose, the cold wind of safety tugging at her torn jacket. She collapsed onto the steel floor with a ragged breath. Inside, she blinked against the glare of the overhead light, adjusting slowly to the sterile interior. A figure turned from the cockpit, a tall man with grizzled stubble and a flight suit worn at the seams. He held her gaze for a long second. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a faded patch, her old insignia. She stared at it, disoriented for a moment, then nodded once. Recognition flickered between them. He didn't need her name. She didn't need his. Their insignia spoke louder than words. He gave a curt nod, then turned back to his controls. She leaned her head against the wall, the hum of the engine vibrating through her bones, and for the first time in hours, allowed herself to feel the weight of everything. They were in the air. They were alive. And somehow, against all odds, someone had remembered. Somewhere deep in the thick canopies of the Kanabari Highlands, thunder cracked above the treetops, and the wind stirred up a storm of dust and leaves. The rescue helicopter hovered above the jungle clearing where Arya's team had made contact earlier, preparing to drop a rope line to lift the survivors. The emergency frequency was alive with overlapping voices, coordinates, weather warnings, and last-minute calls from other rescue units trying to locate wounded personnel trapped across the conflict-ridden terrain. But inside the cockpit of that particular chopper was Lieutenant Mason Reyes, a veteran pilot known for his unshakable calm in impossible situations. As the clearing widened below and the silhouettes of movement flickered between flashes of lightning, his co-pilot pointed out a signal mirror glinting from the ground. Reyes leaned forward, peering through the storm-specked windshield, trying to make out who had made it through the last enemy push. He spotted a figure waving a flare. No helmet, hair slicked back with rain, covered in mud and blood, holding another body slumped across her back. His chest tightened when he saw the insignia, a faded patch barely clinging to the torn sleeve of her uniform, a phoenix rising through a burning sky. Unit 14 Delta, codenamed Fireline, long presumed lost in the Gorham ambush 2 years ago. Reyes squinted, heart racing as the storm jolted the chopper sideways. He stabilized it with muscle memory alone, but his mind was already racing ahead. Fireline? That unit was wiped out. Or so everyone thought. And yet here was one of them, dragging another through the mud, while smoke from a nearby ridge curled into the sky. Reyes activated his comms and radioed base, overriding the chatter with urgency. "I need immediate green light for extraction. Repeat, immediate extraction. Survivor on site from 14 Delta. I have visual." The response was chaos. Static. Then someone from Tactical Operations replied with confusion. "Say again, Lieutenant? 14 Delta was declared KIA 2 years ago." But Reyes didn't care. He flipped the override and took the chopper lower. descending dangerously close to the tree line as the rotor blades stirred a whirlwind of debris across the clearing. Below, Arya shielded her eyes, teeth clenched, hoisting Rafi higher onto her back. The sound of the helicopter was deafening, but in that moment, it was salvation. She couldn't see who was piloting. She didn't know that the person in the cockpit was the same man who had once flown her into the worst mission of her life. But Reyes remembered her. Not just the patch, not just the unit. He remembered the rookie who jumped off his chopper without hesitation, the soldier who radioed for medevac after rescuing 2 teammates pinned under debris. She had fire in her eyes then, and now she looked like she had walked straight out of hell. The harness dropped, swinging wildly in the wind, and she hooked it around Rafi's limp frame before signaling them to haul him up. She didn't ask to go first. She didn't plead. She just stepped back, knees trembling, and waited while Rafi was lifted into the sky. Inside the helicopter, the crew rushed to stabilize the injured man. Reyes kept his eyes on the woman below. She stumbled once, catching herself against the roots of a fallen tree, her other hand wrapped tightly around her field journal. She didn't wave for the harness again. She just looked up, unblinking, as if daring the wind to knock her over. Reyes barked over the headset, "Get the harness back down. Now. She's next." But the base transmission interrupted again. Negative. Extraction protocol limits to 1 passenger due to storm conditions and weight limit. Advised to reroute. Reyes cut the line. "This isn't protocol. This is fireline. I'm not leaving her behind." Down below, Arya saw the cable lower again and clipped herself in with fingers shaking from fatigue. Her vision blurred, her legs collapsing as she rose toward the chopper, arms cradling the journal against her chest like a newborn. When she finally landed inside the aircraft, she collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath. Reyes turned in his seat just long enough to meet her eyes. For a moment, neither said a word. Rain slammed against the sides of the helicopter. The crew shouted over the noise, and Rafi was already hooked to an oxygen mask. But between them it was quiet, just the recognition of 2 people who had both carried something for far too long. "Welcome back, Sergeant Winters," Reyes said softly, before turning back to the controls and guiding them away from the storm. As they climbed above the treetops, Arya blinked against the light, every muscle in her body screaming, but her grip on the journal never loosened. Inside it were the stories of every person she'd lost, the mistakes, the victories, the unreported acts of bravery that never made it to the command logs. As the jungle disappeared below, and the world opened up into an expanse of thunderclouds and wind, Arya allowed herself, for the first time in years, to close her eyes. Not because she was safe yet, but because for the first time since the mission began, someone had finally seen her. Not just as a survivor, not just as a soldier, but as part of something that refused to die, even when the world had written them off. Firelines still burned, and someone had remembered. The dust settled in the wake of the last outbound medevac, a trail of gray smoke marking its path across the charred skyline. But the fire inside Selena burned brighter than ever. She stood still in the temporary medical tent, her sleeves rolled up, hands trembling not from exhaustion but from the urgency coursing through her veins. Lieutenant Kim had finally radioed in, barely audible, static-wrapped, but his message had confirmed one undeniable fact: they were alive. Trapped, low on supplies, hemmed in by enemy insurgents, and awaiting a rescue that might never come. For hours, Selena paced the edge of the command zone, fighting off the chain of higher-ups who continued to brush her off, treating her request to lead a mission as little more than a nuisance. They didn't see the fire in her eyes, or worse, they mistook it for insubordination rather than purpose. She wasn't acting on impulse, she was moving on instinct. She knew her team better than anyone, and she knew they would do the same for her. It took a stroke of luck, a sliver of timing, and one look from Colonel Santos, newly arrived from a forward base with rank and influence, to make the conversation shift. He had been scanning the tents, checking wounded, and handing out curt orders when his eyes fell on Selena. Maybe it was the dirt-streaked uniform with the faded insignia. Maybe it was the intensity behind her eyes, or the stubborn way she clutched the mission file to her chest. He walked up without a word, took the folder from her hands, opened it, and read in silence. Minutes passed. Selena didn't breathe. Then he nodded once, handed it back, and said, "You've got a green light. One hello, one shot." That was all she needed. By dawn, she was in the air with a new crew, a ragtag team of volunteers and misfits who had heard enough whispers about what Selena had done to keep half a unit alive without backup. Among them was a field medic named Nico, a quiet weapons specialist named Drew, and the same grizzled pilot, Ramirez, who once refused to let her board days ago. This time, he didn't hesitate. "I saw the patch," he grunted, buckling his harness. "And I saw what you did for that kid in the rubble. We're with you, Chief." The sun broke the horizon as they soared over the ravaged countryside. Silence in the chopper, save for the beating of blades and the whispered prayers muttered under breath. Selena studied the terrain below, comparing landmarks to what little intel they had. Everything had changed. Trees burned, roads crumbled, villages abandoned or overrun. But she followed the feeling in her gut, a compass that had never failed her before. The site where Kim last made contact was wedged between a ravine and an old communications bunker. It was enemy-held territory now, but from above, there were signs. Tarps laid in a specific shape, a makeshift flag that only those who served in Unit Echo Sierra would recognize. It was a message to her. "Drop zone's hot," Ramirez warned. "We'll need to circle tight. No guarantees on a clean lift." Selena didn't flinch. "Just get me close enough to get them out." She wasn't sure how she leapt from the chopper, whether it was a calculated jump or a desperate dive. But the moment her boots hit the earth, she was running. Gunfire cracked in the distance. She ducked behind concrete, signaling to her team to follow, then led them through the wreckage of the bunker's perimeter. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and desperation. A weak voice called her name. Kim. He looked thinner, his uniform torn, arms slung in a blood-soaked bandage. Around him were the survivors. 3 other Echo Sierra soldiers, 2 civilians they had protected, and a young boy barely old enough to speak. Selena crouched beside them, checking pulses, counting breaths. Relief flooded through her, but she had no time to bask in it. "Extraction in 5, she muttered, signaling her team to prepare. The enemy would be closing in fast now, drawn to the noise and movement. Nico and Drew set up cover, laying suppressive fire as Selena helped lift Kim to his feet. "Told you I'd come back," she said quietly. He gave her a half-smile through cracked lips. "Took you long enough." They moved as one, every second a gamble. Bullets zipped past. One struck near Nico, who threw himself to the side, shielding a civilian. Drew returned fire, his jaw clenched in determination. They reached the clearing just as the chopper descended, blades slicing through the morning mist. Ramirez hovered with skill honed by years of dodging death. Selena shouted orders, pushing civilians up first, then her team. A sudden explosion rocked the side of the bunker, an enemy grenade, and the earth quaked beneath them. Dust and smoke billowed as she shoved Kim onto the skids, climbing up behind him. As the last foot cleared the deck, the helicopter lifted sharply, veering away as gunfire chased them like angry bees. For a moment, the silence returned, broken only by the ragged breathing of survivors, the hum of rotors, and the look in Kim's eyes as he gripped her shoulder. "You saved us," she shook her head. "We saved each other." They flew toward the rising sun, away from the nightmare that had nearly claimed them. Below, the battlefield still burned, but up here, in this fragile cradle of metal and hope, a different kind of fire lit Selena's chest, one made of purpose, loyalty, and the unspoken promise that no soldier would ever be forgotten, not on her watch. The wind carried the scent of fuel and freedom as Marnie sat on the edge of the landing pad, boots dangling over the edge, eyes fixed on the jagged horizon she had once fought so hard to protect. The base was quiet now, a far cry from the roaring chaos that had defined her most pivotal hours here. The helicopters stood lined in solemn silence, and she could still feel the thunder of their rotors in her bones, the same rhythm that once denied her an exit but later carried her home. Her hand reached instinctively for the patch on her shoulder, now framed behind glass and gifted to her by the pilot who had once recognized it in the nick of time. There was a story in that cloth, a thread woven through the heat and heartbreak of a mission that would never make it into the official reports, but had left scars and strength etched deep into her soul. Her presence at the ceremony that morning had felt surreal. They had unveiled a bronze plaque at the base's perimeter wall, commemorating the Forgotten Rescue, a nod to Operation Ridgevale and the clandestine effort to pull her remaining unit out alive. Marnie had stood flanked by 2 generations of soldiers, many of whom had only heard whispers of her story. She watched them absorb her image with reverence, not because she sought recognition, but because they saw in her a mirror of what they might one day become, broken but rebuilt, forgotten but never truly erased. There was something healing about the way they listened, not for her rank or her accolades, but for the humanity she carried back with her. Beside her had stood Commander Lionel Brandt, now retired, his once proud figure slowed by age but his eyes sharp as ever. He had whispered, just before the plaque was unveiled, that he'd known who she was long before the pilot pointed it out. He'd seen her unit's insignia in the archives after the Ridgevale conflict, stored away with a dozen others deemed non-essential during triage extractions. The moment he had laid eyes on that pilot's hesitation and the look in Marnie's, he knew that oversight had just collided with conscience. But he said nothing then, because he had wanted the recognition to come from those still in the fight, not from faded pages. Marnie had nodded, accepting his confession with a grace that surprised even her. What mattered now wasn't the delay in seeing her, but that someone had seen her at all. Later, back in the common area of the rehabilitated base-turned-memorial center, she sipped black coffee in solitude while flipping through a dusty binder containing testimonies from survivors. Someone had added hers, handwritten in the margins. It hadn't been her words, but it told of her actions, the calmness in her commands under fire, the tenderness with which she'd wrapped wounded limbs, the way she had shielded the youngest medic in their group during a mortar burst. She traced the ink with trembling fingers, not because it flattered her, but because it captured the echoes she had long tried to silence. Her story wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to the families who had waited, the comrades who hadn't made it, and the strangers who'd one day draw strength from a war story with no medals but immeasurable worth. As she stepped outside into the afternoon sun, her shadow long across the tarmac, she spotted the pilot from all those years ago leaning against a fence. Gray had started to sprinkle his once dark hair, but his eyes still gleamed with the clarity of that pivotal moment. They exchanged no words, only a nod. It was all that was needed between 2 people who had once stared down bureaucracy, chaos, and loss, and emerged bearing witness. A small group of cadets jogged past, breaking the quiet. One of them slowed, breathless, and pointed at her. "That's the one," he whispered to another. "That's the woman they almost left behind." Marnie didn't flinch at the phrase. It no longer stung like it once had. Instead, she smiled faintly, because he was right in part. They had almost left her. But the other part, the one that mattered, was that they hadn't. That insignia on her shoulder had spoken when words failed, when protocol faltered. It had reminded one pilot, one human being, that not all files tell the truth. And sometimes, what saves you isn't rank or orders, but being recognized, deeply and rightly, by someone who sees what others overlook. In the end, Marnie walked away not as a legend, nor a martyr, but as something far more enduring, a keeper of stories, a reminder that no act of courage is ever truly lost, and that even in the silence after war, there are names that still echo, if only someone listens closely enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.